She was only 6 years old, too small to hold a crown, too fragile to carry the weight of a kingdom. Yet, in a cold medieval hall filled with whispers of power, she was handed to a man 23 years older. Her childhood was stolen in an instant. No toys, no laughter, only a bed she never asked for, and a crown that became her prison. History wrote it as a royal marriage, but behind the stone walls, it was something far darker, a story of innocence buried alive, and a silence that still screams through the centuries. This is not just history. This is a wound the world chose to forget. The kingdom rose like a fortress of stone against the grey sky, its spires piercing the clouds like spears aimed at heaven. To outsiders, it was a place of glory, gleaming banners on castle walls, armoured knights parading through cobbled streets, and the thunder of church bells declaring the strength of a dynasty. But beneath the golden stone, the truth was much darker. In the villages beyond the gates, families starved. Fields were stripped bare by endless wars fought in the king's name. The people bent their backs in silence, knowing that rebellion meant death and obedience meant survival. The crown fed itself on their suffering, and the church whispered that such suffering was holy. It was a world where cruelty was not seen as cruelty. It was tradition. A child was not a child if her bloodline carried value. She was property, a vessel, a thread in the endless weaving of power. And so, in this kingdom, no one gasped when word spread that a 6-year-old girl would soon stand at the altar. They did not cry for her. They called it fate. The castle itself seemed to echo her coming tragedy. Its walls were damp with centuries of secrets. Torches burned low in hallways where countless forgotten servants had walked before. The great hall was polished for the ceremony, yet the stone floor still bore scars of executions carried out in the same space. This was not a place of safety. It was a place of sacrifice, where innocence was traded for ambition, and no one left untouched. She was too small to understand why the servants whispered when she passed. Her world was not crowns or thrones. It was dolls carved from wood, lullabies sung by her nurse, and the thrill of chasing butterflies in the gardens when no one was watching. She giggled at the sight of sparrows pecking crumbs in the courtyard, and she still cried when she scraped her knees on the stone paths. But slowly, those simple joys were taken away. The toys were locked in a chest, the gardens became forbidden, and her nurse's lullabies were replaced by stern instructions. How to walk without stumbling, how to bow without shaking, how to wear jewels that weighed heavier than her tiny arms could bear. The child did not understand why the seamstresses measured her for gowns fit for a queen. She did not understand why bishops spoke to her of duty, sin, and obedience. She only knew that the adults no longer smiled the way they once did. Their eyes avoided hers. Their words were sharp with urgency. Something was coming, and she was at the center of it. At night, when the torches outside her chamber flickered, she whispered to her nurse, "Why can't I sleep with my dolls anymore? Why do they make me wear this heavy crown?" But no answer ever came that could soothe her. Instead, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Every step she took now was watched, every gesture corrected, and in her heart, though she could not name it, she felt the weight of something being stolen. Her childhood, piece by piece, wrapped in silks she never asked to wear. While the child struggled to understand the meaning of the jewels forced upon her, the king and his council saw only strategy. To them, she was not a daughter, not a child, not a soul trembling with fear. She was a key to bind bloodlines, secure thrones, and silence rivals. In the royal chambers, parchment maps stretched across tables, stained with candle wax and ink. Advisors leaned over them, speaking not of innocence or morality, but of territories, armies, and alliances. To secure power, they argued, the king must act swiftly. A child's life was nothing compared to the survival of a dynasty. The king himself, a man hardened by war and hungry for control, listened in silence. He did not need to be persuaded. He had long been taught that power was a God-given right, and that any sacrifice made in its pursuit was sanctified. His eyes, cold and calculating, never once lingered on the girl as a child. He saw her only as an heir-bearer, a fragile vessel to strengthen his legacy. Around him, the church blessed the union. Priests declared it holy, cloaking cruelty in divine language. Courtiers nodded, their whispers feeding the lie that tradition demanded obedience. Not one voice in the hall dared to cry out in protest. Not one soul spoke for the child. And so, the walls closed in. Every corridor of the castle became a cage. Every ritual, every prayer, every word spoken over her small head became a chain binding her to a fate she could neither escape nor understand. By the time the great hall was prepared for the ceremony, her life was no longer her own. She was a prisoner of ambition, a victim dressed as a bride, her innocence buried beneath silk and stone. The trap had been set, and there was no way out. The hall was drowned in gold. Chandeliers dripped with candlelight, their flames reflected in polished silver cups and jeweled crowns. Nobles lined the stone walls in velvet robes, whispering with voices sharp as knives. Outside, bells rang as though heralding triumph. But inside, at the center of it all, stood a child too small to even lift her own veil. Her gown trailed across the floor like a shroud, embroidered with symbols she could not read, stitched by hands that never asked her consent. Heavy jewels pressed against her neck, choking her with every breath. The crown slid forward on her head, too large for her tiny frame, its weight bowing her shoulders. The king stood beside her, towering like a shadow cast across her fragile world. His armor gleamed, his presence commanding the silence of the hall. To the crowd, he was a hero, a ruler, a man chosen by heaven. To the child, he was a stranger whose hand swallowed hers, whose voice echoed promises she did not understand. Priests stepped forward, their chants rising like smoke, cloaking the cruelty in holy words. They called it sacred. They called it destiny. But what unfolded on that altar was not love, nor faith, nor union. It was the erasure of a childhood in front of 1,000 unblinking eyes. When the vows were spoken, her voice was barely a whisper, trembling not from devotion, but from fear. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers drowning the silence of her tears. Trumpets blared, banners waved, and the hall shook with celebration. Yet within her, a quiet death had taken place, the burial of innocence, sealed with a ring too heavy for her tiny fingers. The celebrations ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than the toll of 1,000 bells. The child was led through endless corridors of stone, her small steps echoing against walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Servants bowed, courtiers whispered, and all eyes followed her, not with pity, but with expectation. She was no longer allowed to play in gardens or clutch her wooden doll. Instead, she was taught to sit still for hours, as golden threads were woven into gowns too heavy for her shoulders. Lessons replaced lullabies. The language of duty was carved into her, though she barely understood the words. "You are a queen now," they told her, as if repeating it would make it true. Yet, in the dim silence of her chambers, she remained what she had always been, a frightened little girl. The jeweled crown cut into her scalp. The rings slipped from her small fingers. She cried quietly at night, but the stone walls did not answer, and the nurse who once held her was gone, replaced by attendants who bowed but never embraced. Meanwhile, the king basked in triumph. To him, she was proof of power, a trophy paraded before rivals and allies alike. Nobles praised his wisdom, priests blessed his union, and chroniclers sharpened their quills to record his glory. None of them wrote of the child's tears. None of them dared. The cruelty was not in his hands alone. It lived in the silence of every voice that refused to speak. Each courtier, each priest, each servant who looked away became another brick in the walls of her prison. And the louder the kingdom cheered, the deeper her silence was buried. Days blurred into nights, and the girl began to understand a terrible truth. Her cries would never be heard. The crown had stolen not only her childhood, but her voice. She was trapped, not by chains of iron, but by a silence so complete it was indistinguishable from death. The castle grew colder with each passing night. Her chamber, once lit with soft lamps, now seemed a tomb where silence pressed against her like a weight she could not lift. Servants dressed her in gowns she could barely carry, rings slipped from her small fingers, and every word spoken to her was a command. She nodded. She obeyed. She endured. But inside, the child was unraveling. Her eyes, once bright with the laughter of gardens and sparrows, dulled into glass. She no longer asked about her toys. She no longer spoke of butterflies. The crown pressed into her scalp like a brand, a constant reminder that her childhood had been taken, her innocence replaced with duties she could not name. In the great hall, they cheered her presence. "Our queen," they cried, lifting their cups. Yet not one of them saw the way her tiny frame shook beneath her jewels, nor the way her lips quivered when she forced herself to stand. Every cheer felt like a stone laid upon her chest, every blessing a nail sealing the coffin of her youth. Behind closed doors, the truth was impossible to ignore. This was not a marriage. It was a sentence, a ritual cloaked in gold, but inside it, the slow destruction of a child. The king looked upon her not as a daughter of innocence, but as an emblem of his triumph. The priests who spoke of God's will did not speak of mercy. The nobles who praised his wisdom did not whisper of compassion. And in their silence, they became executioners, each one complicit in burying her alive. Her voice faded into whispers that no one cared to hear. Her spirit, once restless and bright, was crushed beneath layers of obedience. She was queen by title, but prisoner by truth. The world had taken a child and dressed her in silk, then locked her inside a cage made of tradition, ambition, and cruelty. And so, the climax was not a single scream or rebellion. It was the slow extinguishing of a light, a death that unfolded while she was still breathing. The great hall had emptied long ago, yet the echoes of celebration lingered in the stone, like ghosts that refused to fade. The banners had been taken down, the music silenced, the feasts reduced to crumbs on the tables. But within the castle, the girl's world remained unchanged, a gilded prison, heavy with silence. She sat upon a throne far too large for her tiny frame, its cold wood pressing against her back until she slumped under its weight. Courtiers bowed when they entered, their eyes full of calculation, not kindness. Priests blessed her with words she could not understand, their prayers like a fog that wrapped her tighter into obedience. To the world, she was a queen. But inside, she was still only a child, and her crown was nothing more than a chain hammered into gold. Her toys were gone. The laughter of gardens was gone. Even the nurse who once cradled her in quiet moments of fear was gone, dismissed by decree so that no trace of tenderness might soften her. The child's new companions were silence, duty, and the cold watch of 1,000 unfeeling eyes. She learned quickly that tears drew only scorn, that hesitation invited rebuke, that every mistake was punished not with correction, but with shame, and so she buried her cries deep inside, teaching herself to be silent, even when silence felt like suffocation. Days blurred into nights, each one identical to the last. Morning began with priests reminding her of obedience. Afternoon was spent draped in heavy gowns, paraded before nobles who admired the king's triumph, never her. Evening ended in solitude, with candles flickering against stone walls that trapped her in their unyielding embrace. The seasons passed, but for the child time itself had stopped. She did not grow into freedom, she grew only into her chains. Her spirit, once alive with wonder, grew pale. The girl who once reached for sparrows now stared at the floor, her eyes dulled by resignation. The crown dug into her scalp, The ring slipped from her fragile fingers, the jewels cut into her skin, but worse than the physical weight was the weight of invisibility. She was seen by all, yet known by none, and still the kingdom praised itself. Chroniclers recorded the union as destiny fulfilled, a triumph of lineage and power. Nobles toasted their fortune, priests blessed the holiness of sacrifice, and the king wore his pride like armor. None of them ever wrote of the silence that smothered her. None of them remembered that behind the title of queen was a child, already broken, her innocence buried alive in the marble floors of the throne room. The aftermath of that union was not fire or war, not banners torn or blood spilled. It was quieter, crueler. It was a child erased before she ever had the chance to live. She had become a shadow draped in silk, a ghost wandering through corridors, alive but already lost to the silence that claimed her. Her story did not end with her silence, nor did it remain her own. Across the kingdoms of the medieval world, her suffering echoed in countless others whose names were never written down. For every child crowned in ceremony, there were hundreds forced into beds they never asked for, into marriages that consumed their youth like a fire devouring dry leaves. The chronicles preserved the glory of kings and the rise of dynasties, but they erased the trembling hands of children who were offered up as sacrifices to power. The union of a 6-year-old bride to a man nearly 5 times her age was not seen as cruelty by her world. It was seen as strategy. To the nobles, it was an alliance sealed. To the priests, it was a blessing. To the king, it was triumph. And so history repeated itself. Not just with her, but with countless others who bore the same fate. She was not the first, nor the last. She was a single voice drowned in a sea of silence. What made her story darker still was the way it became precedent. Her suffering was not an accident. It was a blueprint. When kingdoms grew hungry for more power, they reached not for swords, but for children. Daughters became bargaining chips, sons became pawns, and the innocence of both was stripped away long before they could speak of their own desires. A child's hand clasped in the hand of a ruler was celebrated as diplomacy, never as tragedy. And beneath the grand narrative of royal politics, there was something even more insidious. The cruelty was not only in the marriage itself, but in who was chosen to bear it. Race, class, and gender shaped who would be sacrificed. The daughters of the powerful were married off in gilded cages, their suffering hidden behind jewels. But the daughters of the poor, the foreign, the enslaved, they were not even given the illusion of crowns. Their pain was raw, open, unrecorded. The girl at the heart of this story became a symbol of something larger than herself, the machinery of silence that grinds down the vulnerable. The nobles toasted her marriage. The people whispered about destiny. But no one asked what it meant for a child to lose her life before it even began. That silence was the truest cruelty, because it allowed the pattern to stretch on for centuries. The cruelty dressed itself as tradition. The abuse cloaked itself as holiness. The injustice paraded itself as progress. And all the while, children disappeared behind closed doors, their stories erased, their voices silenced. What was celebrated in daylight left scars that bled in darkness. And so, her life was not just her own tragedy. It was part of a greater wound, a wound carved into history by the hands of those who valued power above innocence. That wound has never healed, because silence has always been its strongest weapon. History closes its pages too quickly. It tells us of kings, crowns, and kingdoms won, but it forgets the children buried beneath those triumphs. It forgets the little girl who was given away before she could even understand the meaning of her own name. To the world, she was a queen. To herself, she was nothing more than a shadow, trapped in a body that never had a chance to be free. But her story is not just hers. It is the story of every child silenced in the name of tradition. It is the story of every daughter who was told her worth lay not in her laughter or her dreams, but in how well she could serve the hunger of men, older, stronger, more powerful. It is the story of how cruelty disguises itself in ceremony, how abuse parades as holiness, how injustice survives because too many choose not to see. And the question remains, how many voices are still unheard today? How many innocents are still sacrificed, not with crowns and thrones, but in the shadows of systems that continue to trade innocence for ambition? If we tell ourselves this was only history, we are blind. The same silence that stole her life still lingers in our world. Different names, different rituals, but the same cruelty. Her life ended in silence, but her story does not have to. It can be a mirror, showing us the cost of turning away. It can be a warning, reminding us that every time we excuse cruelty as tradition, we become part of the chain that binds the innocent. And it can be a call, asking us whether we will continue to celebrate crowns built on suffering, or whether we will finally dare to break the silence. Because in the end, the crown did not matter. The throne did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the life of a child who never got to live.